Welcome to Pasa, HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic serving institutions. I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness. Saludos, HSI familia, and welcome to episode 9 of ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? As we enter November, many of us are getting tired after working hard to launch another year and welcome back our new and returning students. Today's episode of ¿Qué pasa, HSIs might be the energy and rejuvenation you need as we talk about leading and enacting servingness con cariño with Dr. Marla Franco from the University of Arizona. Enacting servingness in practice can be exactly what you want it to be and exactly what your campus and your students need it to be. And Dr. Franco is the epitome of doing this work with your heart and soul and with your ancestors in mind. What and who would our ancestors want us to be is a question that guides Dr. Franco's work. In this episode of ¿Qué pasa, HSIs, Marla Franco, who's the inaugural Assistant Vice Provost for HSI Initiatives at the University of Arizona, shares insight into the intentional ways she implements servingness con cariño and offers best practices. She talks extensively about her quote-unquote baby, the HSI Fellows Program, which has not only become a vehicle for advancing servingness on campus, but also serves as a retention tool for faculty and staff on campus. Dr. Franco also talks about her engagement with Tucson and greater Arizona community and how she has been a part of many initiatives, including the implementation of the AZ HSI Consortium. Marla recognizes that this work cannot be done alone and shares the importance of having a collective group of committed leaders to do this with. Dr. Franco is a first-generation college graduate, having earned a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, a master's degree in counseling from California State University, Long Beach, and a doctoral degree in higher education from Azusa Pacific University. She is mom to 2 teenagers and is very active in the community, often posting pictures of her monthly bike rides through Tucson with her community on Instagram. She is my colleague and friend and one of my most trusted HSI co-conspirators. I have followed her work since she was an assessment professional documenting ways to measure and assess servingness even before the multidimensional conceptual framework for understanding servingness in HSIs was published. I hope you have paper and a pen as Dr. Franco shares extensive knowledge in this episode worth taking notes on. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with today's episode of ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? Today we have Dr. Franco. Thank you for taking the time to be here today on ¿Qué pasa, HSIs, where we talk about all things Hispanic serving institutions. But before we talk about HSIs, I like to start out by just knowing a little bit about you, make sure our listeners know a little bit about you. We're higher ed scholars and practitioners. So tell us a little bit about your higher education journey and how you came to be where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited to be here. I'm super excited for the launch of this podcast as well. I think it's an exciting endeavor, so I can't wait to hear all the episodes. So a little bit about me. I'm actually originally from Southern California, born and raised, and started my higher education journey in the UC system as a student. So first generation Latina college student navigating her way up to Northern California to pursue higher education. And so certainly I draw a lot upon my own experiences as a student as I think about my work at each of the respective higher education institutions I've worked at. And so did undergrad at UC Berkeley and then, continued my first generation, kind of scholar identity over at Cal State Long Beach, where I earned a master's in counseling and higher education. And then a few years later after that, earned a doctorate, a PhD at Azusa Pacific University. And so 2 out of 3 are HSIs. And so got to be a part of that aspect. Although I think, back in those days, it was so so less talked about, so unknown, not really a thing, right? And it's interesting, nowadays, many of the UC schools are either HSIs or aspiring HSIs. So it makes me reflect a lot upon, my own higher education journey there and the aspirations that I see today versus what my experience was back then. But interestingly, after I finished undergrad, had a couple of jobs, out of college and was not really kind of like feeling them. And actually my mom worked at Cal State Los Angeles. She worked at the health center there. And it just so happened that there was kind of an elder over in the College of Engineering who, kind of helped make a connection for me professionally. And I ended up, interviewing and started off working actually within academic affairs. So I worked in the College of Engineering, Computer Science and Technology at Cal State Los Angeles. But I really literally so much of what I know today and so much of how I lead and learn was taught to me by the students at Cal State Los Angeles, predominantly pulling from, East Los Angeles communities, predominantly students of color, predominantly first gen and Pell recipients. So they really taught me much of what I learned today. And I certainly attribute a lot to them.
Absolutely. And that's such an interesting place to think about it. You're working around HSIs because it probably been an HSI before the designation, right? Because of the location.
Absolutely.
Because of the
absolutely.
Location.
Yeah, absolutely.
So really thinking about that.
Yeah, after Cal State Los Angeles, went to Cal Poly Pomona, served in several appointments, both in student affairs, did some development, auxiliaries, really kind of rounded out my higher education experience, also in HSI, but I think even at that time, it wasn't really predominantly a point of discussion or a focus or any sense of intentionality about it. But I think, also did some really important work there. And, I think all of those experiences collectively have, just really informed, the work that I do today, how I lead, how I learn, the vision that I have. And I think also too, there's a lot that's drawn upon that has nothing to do with higher ed that also influences how I do the work and how I show up, including, family, I think ancestral knowledge, community-based learning and advocacy work is certainly informative and certainly shapes my work.
Absolutely. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that. But something you keep saying is I worked in these HSI spaces. It wasn't really a conversation at the time, even if maybe it is now. So tell us a little bit more about how HSI then came into your consciousness. When did you start having those conversations, and at what point was it a conversation in any of these spaces, or what I call the servingness journey? How did that happen?
Yeah, so I would say that it mostly happened here at the University of Arizona. So I ended up making my way from California, Southern California, to Tucson, Arizona in 2013. And I came here with an opportunity to work at the University of Arizona, oversee assessment and research within one of our divisions. And it was perhaps maybe about 2 years into me having been here, where at the time our senior vice president, began to kind of get curious again about where we were at relative to enrollment, comparatively to meeting the criteria to becoming a federally recognized Hispanic serving institution. And so she asked me to kind of look into things. And I felt like, initially it may have been a real casual request, nothing too heavy. But I think, connected with the request, right? And I really kind of took it to heart and took a deep dive into it, really kind of monitored the enrollment, started to have conversations, started to reach out to colleagues across the nation to really come to understand and ask questions about the work. Some of it was, kind of process and procedural oriented related to the U.S. Department of Education, but otherwise wanted to kind of really gauge their experience in terms of okay, when you became an HSI, what did that process look like for you? How did you navigate, campus conversations? How did you approach the work? And so that casual request from my senior vice president at the time, which came about in 2015, actually came 3 years prior to the official designation. But I think what it did is it allowed kind of an opportunity to have some lead time to begin to figure out, what does this designation really mean? And it really was through conversations that I started having with my colleagues across the nation where I started to kind of like piece things together. And so that's really where I started to have the conversation within my own workplace, within the setting of my employer, of the higher education institution I was working at.
Okay, so really, let's go ahead and then jump into this work you've been doing at the University of Arizona. You've been very successful, obviously, when it comes to enacting and embodying servingness. Somebody who I look to and for ideas often of like, what does servingness really look like in practice? So, talk to us about your role as the inaugural Assistant Vice Provost for Hispanic Servant Institution Initiatives. How this role came about, and what does it entail?
Yeah, so, the designation came to be for us in 2018, and it was later in that same year where there were conversations that I was able to have with the leadership here at the University of Arizona. I would say it was almost kind of like this, perfect storm transition moment for the university, which I think, ended up working to really give way and cultivate, an opportunity for the doors to open to this work. We had just recently had a change in our president. So in our most senior leadership position, we also, were having transition in our provost position. And it was actually kind of our outgoing provost, our interim provost, and also an interim senior vice president of kind of like a student affairs division that really actually helped me put some of this in place before their departure. I think that very early on, there was a lot of strong support and endorsement from our president, as well as that outgoing provost and senior VP. And so they really helped kind of open the doors to what was possible. I think early on understood kind of the opportunity and the potential for impact, as well as our role and responsibility to really, I think, approach the work meaningfully as an HSI. I think one of the things too is that I find this particular institution compared to others that I worked at prior to have an organizational culture that is quite innovative and entrepreneurial. I mean, you literally can go from like ideation to implementation relatively quickly. You can pitch new ideas, you can beta test things, you can pilot things. And if it doesn't work out, then you just don't do it again, right? And if it does, you certainly, provide kind of the evidence of impact and map it on to like the university's strategic plan or something, right? And you can kind of, make things happen here. And so I think those institutional characteristics, as well as, the supportive leadership, really are kind of the key ingredients that helped cultivate what we were able to do in a relatively short amount of time. Like I always have to stop myself and remind myself, like it's been 4 years since 2018. I kind of, on some days I feel like it's been an eternity, and on some days, I feel like it was just yesterday that all of this happened. And so, because of that, we've been able to build quite a bit of institutional capacity. I always say that I am one of 2 individuals who serve at this level of leadership within their institution that has an explicit focus on HSI initiatives. And to be honest, I think when you have a position that allows for that level of focus and allows for that level of institutional leadership and influence and vision, I think that's when things can really speed up and expedite and scale and have impact. Because I think it can be a little bit more challenging if you're located, kind of differently within the organization, where you're maybe not at those tables, you're not sitting on the president's senior leadership team, it's a little bit harder for you to navigate the institution and get that priority and that voice across. And so Oftentimes when I'm talking with colleagues, I think some of those challenges arise for them because organizationally where they're located, or maybe they're a director of HSI efforts or initiatives, and it's often tied to a very specific grant. Oftentimes, a Title V U.S. Department of Education grant or a Title III. And those are wonderful, important, I think, contributions of servingness that are likely happening on their campus, but they're very anchored and tied to very specific objectives, key performance indicators, metrics, and outputs, right? And so I think that sometimes it makes it hard to be perhaps visionary and innovative around the work.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. It was actually going to be my next question of like the importance of it being an assistant vice provost role. Like that's powerful, right? To say HSIs is at that level.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, I think it does something when you are at a table, when you're talking to department heads, when you're talking to college deans, when you're talking to your foundation and development officers, right? When you're talking to your CFO about financial resources and what institutional commitment looks like, right? Or when you're having conversations with your provost, or when you're thinking about, how do I have conversations with the Arizona Board of Regents about this? So, it absolutely does. I think it makes a difference.
For sure. And I hope campuses, folks that are listening that are looking to, aspiring to have an HSI director that's higher, right, at the vice provost level, will turn to y'all's model, because you do absolutely have a powerful model that's helping to move the institution. You've created many programs that we can't talk about all of them, right? Because you've created so many programs that we don't even have enough time. But one of them that I know is really successful and I think is great, and y'all are really pushing the institution in a lot of ways through this program, is the HSI Fellows Program. So talk to us a little bit about that program.
Yeah, so the HSI Fellows Program, that's like my baby. That program also came about around the time of the designation, shortly after the designation, and kind of in between the time that I was appointed to this particular position. But, one of the, I guess, impetus for developing the program, to be honest, comes out of my own experience as a professional here at the University of Arizona. I had applied to this institution's kind of premier leadership development program, which is called the Academic Leadership Program. And, it's a wonderful program. It's highly competitive to get into, but it was something that I aspired for because I felt like I was just ready for the next step here at the University of Arizona. And so, that program was wonderful, but I felt like kind of towards at the end of it, I felt it was a little bit like a cliff dive, right? Like you led me through all of these kind of like amazing cohort-based leadership development experiences. But at the end, I just felt like, okay, I'm ready to do more, give more of myself. Where does this lead to, right? And so, I felt kind of a little bit like stymied towards the end, right? I had more to give, more to love, more passion, to kind of present to the table. And also, so I took that experience, and I also took the experience, to be honest, of moving here from Southern California to Tucson and working here at the University of Arizona. It was a really big culture shift for me. I think that oftentimes when we talk about like that first gen status, no one really talks about how that follows you into your professional career. I've been here now at the University of Arizona for 9 years. And so, 9.5 years ago, when I was contemplating the decision to even come here to the University of Arizona, I think as a Latina, first generation, college student and PhD grad and, professional within this type of setting, I even still felt kind of those cultural ties and expectations to even go and have conversations with my parents and my grandmother about like, I'm possibly thinking about leaving the state, right? And how do we collectively feel about that? Like, I felt like it wasn't just my decision, right? I felt like I was making a decision not only for my immediate family, but also my extended family. It was going to have implications for everyone. And so when I made my way here to the University of Arizona, I was desperately, to be honest, like looking for my people, right? Where do I find a sense of community and a connection and sense of belonging? Like, where do I even find my favorite foods, right? And so, like, I just felt like that wasn't quite set up in a way that was well established, that was welcoming. It just kind of took me longer than I expected to kind of find a sense of home here. And so collectively, I took those experiences and I always say, we can either be bitter or we can be better, right? And I just didn't want others who are employed here at the University of Arizona to feel that experience themselves. And so I definitely give a whole feel and flavor to the HSI Fellows Program, where I say it's the program where you enter as fellows and you leave as family. So what the HSI Fellows Program is, though, is it is a year-long cohort-based leadership development program that essentially cultivates and strengthens our leadership among faculty and staff to really be ambassadors, champions, and change agents centered on servingness as a Hispanic serving institution. I think one of the main objectives of this program is to create a sustainable model to this work. Even though my position is wonderful, right? And it's situated organizationally in a place where I'm able to contribute and influence, I'm just one person, right? And so at no HSI should this rest on, kind of the shoulders of just one person. And so how can we effectively and sustainably, right, build capacity among one of our greatest assets, which are our people, right? The people who give their hearts and souls to working at our respective institutions. And so we keep the cohorts relatively small. It's about 8 to 10 mix of faculty and staff. People have to apply to the HSI Fellows Program, and we always receive way more applications than we can accommodate, which is a great problem to have. And we really kind of treat that cohort as just a real kind of intimate experience. It starts off with a kickoff dinner. And I always say that kickoff dinner, it starts in my home. Because there is no other way to convey a sense where you communicate to another faculty or staff member on your campus. You belong, you matter. This experience is special, right? Than to invite them into your own home. And we, kind of huddle around my large kitchen table and we eat and we share and we connect and we confide in a way that really starts the experience off and really sets the tone and tenor of how we expect this experience to feel. And we talk very candidly about what our experiences have been at the university, within the community, within higher education, and ways in which we want to do better and give more and to show up as a Hispanic serving institution. So the program itself over the course of the year, in addition to that kickoff dinner, has about maybe 8 sessions, and we bring various individuals in from across the nation, including you, Gina. You are always so gracious enough to zoom in and give some of your time. But we also, bring in, for example, students, student advocates. We have had a level of student advocacy, for example, for a couple of years now, where they have presented lists of demands. And I think that there's a lot to learn from student advocacy on our campus. They've got some maneuvering and strategy skills like no other that we could probably learn from. So I brought individuals like that in to talk. I've also, utilized the program to challenge our own notions about who we deem as knowledge holders, right? They're not always, kind of in the 2% of individuals like who are published in the most selective journals, right? They are community members, they are elders, they are leaders of local nonprofit organizations, they are, community organizers, right? And so we bring those in as well, just to kind of honor and validate that that's absolutely valid knowledge that absolutely should be informing how we're thinking about this work, how we're approaching this work. So, and then one of the other components to the work that's really important is the project-based component piece, because it's really important to ensure that we are developing the cohort every year to assume levels of leadership and advocacy and to initiate change within their local sphere or, throughout the university. And so they work in small teams of about, 2, 3, or 4 individuals, and they identify kind of a challenge, gap, or need around servingness. And then they work to actually create and often implement blueprints for institutional change. And so through that collective experience, every single cohort, we are cultivating and grooming this strong, stellar level of ambassadorship and change agents. And so literally like the pond, you're throwing a pebble in the pond and you're seeing that ripple effect. And it's pretty amazing to see some of the things that HSI fellows have gone on to do. And I always say, once a fellow, always a fellow. So, I just kind of identify them as like, oh yeah, you're cohort 1, you're cohort 2. And it's exciting. We're onboarding cohort 5 will come to my house this September for their special launch dinner. So super excited.
Wow, you just said a lot. And I've heard this story before, and I have never thought about it in this way. But as a researcher, I'm going to code this as servingness for faculty and staff. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important because everything you said to me, we could have replaced that this program was for faculty and staff with students, right?
Absolutely.
And we generally focus on students. We want to create a sense of belonging for students. We want to create cohorts for students. We want to acknowledge students' community cultural well. We want them to feel like they belong. I mean, all of these things. And you said all of that, but it's for faculty and staff.
Absolutely.
That's powerful. Yeah. So I'm going to code it as servingness for faculty and staff.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Because in the reality is if your faculty and your staff don't feel all those things, they're leaving.
True.
Then when your Latinx faculty and staff that you just hired, you hired 20 and now 18 went out the back door and you're like, well, now you netted 2.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, some of the magic that happens as well. There's so much mentoring. There's peer-to-peer mentoring within the cohort. There's mentorship that I give. Others that I bring into the experience often will mentor them as well. These people, end up, taking on things that are unimaginable here at this institution, advancing their own efforts, bringing innovative ways to approach the work on their own, and so it's happening right before my eyes, like the payoff, the impact, the scale. But, you're right. Sometimes these fellows will tell me, kind of later in the experience or a year later, 2 years later, they'll say like, if it wasn't for the fellows program, I don't know that I'd still be working here. Right. Or, they found perhaps maybe some, just like limitations within, their own work environment. And maybe they went and moved on to a different department within the same institution and now are, flying and really kind of implementing equity focused work. So it's just been interesting to see the trajectory like of each one of them. And to be honest, there's actually some who have left the university, but are tremendous change agents in the local community. And I still chalk that up to a major win because they're now like the CFO, for example, for, Tucson Unified School District, or like they're doing community development work for, Southern Arizona American Heart Association, right? And so think about kind of the disproportionate like health equity impacts to the community, here in Southern Arizona. So they're advancing the work outside of the boundaries of our institution, which is pretty cool. And I often feel like this is also kind of like an area where there's not a ton of higher education institutions. So I always feel like, it's more like of a swirl, right? Like you might work here and then you'll go work in the community, and then, it wouldn't be surprising if those folks came back, and worked in different capacities. So.
Absolutely. All right. So we're going to call it a retention mechanism, a servingness for faculty and staff, affinity group. I mean, so many things, right, that have come out of that program. So thank you for sharing, because it absolutely advances the capacity of the institution to do this work. So let's talk a little bit about another initiative you've been a part of, that I wish all states would go ahead and do. So let's learn a little bit about what y'all have done in Arizona, which is launch an HSI Consortium. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was kind of cool because that also has a link to the HSI Fellows Program. And I think it was in the second cohort. So 2 cohort members took on kind of the charge that I gave them. I was like, I've seen, and I think that there are these regional and statewide consortiums elsewhere. Let's go research the heck out of them, like come to understand like their structure, their purpose, right? Are they fee-based? What are their priorities and core sets of activities? How long have they been in existence? Do people get voted in? How does it work essentially? So we came to examine 4 states. Some of them had regional models, some of them had statewide models. So we looked at Southern California's regional model, Texas has a statewide, Nevada has a statewide, and then Florida at the time kind of had a regional model. So we kind of, the 2 HSI fellows took a deep dive, engaged with each of those consortium and really kind of came to understand what they were all about. And then we essentially used that to inform the launch of what's called the AZ HSI Consortium, which serves as a statewide model, a community of practice, to really help connect the dots and tie us together as a community of practice as HSIs. Here in Arizona, we have incrementally seen growth in the number of both HSIs and emerging HSIs. And so, noticing that there was this trend and certainly not wanting people to struggle and figuring this work out in isolation, right? Also seeing that there was opportunity in coming together to do this work. So I serve as the founder to the AZ HSI Consortium, and I was able to enlist the collaboration and support of a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Ray Rivera, who serves as the president of Estrella Mountain Community College. I wanted to make sure that there was both representation from a 4-year and a 2-year HSI, who were really part of the founding leadership for the consortium. Knowing that nationally 44% approximately of HSIs are community colleges, and that trend is essentially mirrored in the state of Arizona. So I wanted to make sure that there was solid representation from 2 years and 4 years. And so we did a soft launch about a year and a half or so ago, towards the earlier part of the pandemic. We convened presidents and chancellors from across the state of Arizona, HSIs, pulled them together, to kind of gauge their interest. Was it something that they wanted to proceed with? And we also, quickly, I think, gleaned some of the things that they wanted to see from the consortium, ways in which they felt their institution could be supported by the development of consortium. So we did a soft launch, and soon after that, we launched a website off of the AZ, the University of Arizona's HSI webpage. We launched a listserv so that we could quickly enable exchange of information, best practices, ideas, advertisement and communication about events, and that exchange could go in any direction. Anyone could share that information. And then we also, Dr. Rivera and I established a steering committee. We wanted to make sure that we were enlarging, right, and broadening the leadership who could really provide further direction to mobilize and move towards building a solid consortium. And so we have some amazing individuals from some of our community colleges that are HSI. So we have, for example, the president of Arizona Western Community College, the provost of Pima Community College, We also have certainly a few more from Cochise College, Dean of Students out there. And also, too, very strategically, there's two individuals who are on the steering committee, one from Maricopa Community College at the district level, and then one who is a staff member at the Arizona Board of Regents, right? And so those help give us, kind of district or system level ties, which was, by design, by strategy, right? And then since then, interestingly, I was able to get a meeting with our foundation who helped facilitate a meeting with the Helios Education Foundation. And we were telling them about, the AZ HSI Consortium. It aligns exceptionally well with their mission, which really is advancing educational success for Latino students within the states of Arizona and Florida specifically. And they invited us to submit a proposal several months ago. And as a result, awarded us a $100,000 planning grant, a one-year planning grant to really help shore up the foundation to this consortium. And they're very much interested in continuing, the partnership, moving forward. We've also, received support actually from the Community Foundation of Arizona as well. And so it's been great to find some common alignment and mission, but I think it's been a really great opportunity for leaders across Arizona HSIs to really band together, exchange best practices that work for us, HSIs in the state of Arizona, right? I think oftentimes I tell people, these kind of best practices or evidence-based practices, right? There's no shortage of higher educational literature on that. But, all too often when you get to the end of the study, and it focuses on, the limitations of the study, oftentimes it will say, yes, this didn't prove to be effective for students of color, first-generation college students, or low-income Pell eligible students, right? So essentially, those don't work for students at HSIs then. So how do we develop, right, a process and start to really curate like our own practices that are demonstrating impact for our students at our HSIs in the state of Arizona? And that's some of the work that we're heavily steeped in. We're also going to be hosting our very first AZ HSI Consortium Summit in the fall that will convene HSIs and emerging HSIs, including students, faculty, staff, administrators, community leaders, and industry partners, to really exchange best practices, engage in discussion, and hopefully, enable some new synergistic partnerships to develop. So super excited about that work. This is really only the beginning.
Wow, so powerful. I love that all the programs and initiatives you start with research, right? You're like, the HSI Fellows, they did their research, right? They dug in and who's doing these consortiums and what did they do and how could ours be different and how are we going to make it specific to Arizona? And now I know it's called AZ HSI Consortium. Okay, I'll call it AZ. I thought that was just short for Arizona.
Well, yeah, it is.
I get it. So all of this, you obviously have had good successes. So for folks listening, they're like, wow, we're just getting started in the Servingness. And, Dr. Franco's over there just like crushing the game. What are some key elements to becoming a successful HSI?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I always love having conversations with colleagues, across the nation about that. And I also just kind of like caution folks to just be, I think be gracious with themselves. Like, I don't want them to feel like they're, kind of behind the game necessarily. I think we all have a starting point in this work. There were people that I reached out to, back when I described my starting point, in 2015, when I got that super informal inquiry to look into this from my senior VP, right? That's where I felt like I was, starting behind the eight ball, right? And I was reaching out to colleagues, particularly those in California, who had at least, a couple of years, if not more, under their belt of experience. So everyone has a starting point. Every institution has a starting point. Every colleague has a starting point in this work. So I think we all just kind of need to be, gracious with ourselves about that. But I think the second thing that I would also, communicate and echo is, just to be super cautious about, not, there's no need to kind of carbon copy things, right? I mean, I think we can, certainly learn from some of the practices that are sprinkled across all of our institutions. But I also think, one of the things that's really important, though, is to kind of take stock and come to understand intrinsically, your own institution, right? Because I'm designing things that are responsive to the University of Arizona's needs, right? So, you and another institution need to come to understand what your institution's needs are, right? And how do you do that, right? How do you engage, students, staff, faculty, alumni, community members, legislators, whatever those key stakeholder groups might be, right? How do you come to understand what those needs are? Take stock of existing assets. You're probably not starting from square one on this, right? And through that process, sometimes it's quite illuminating through the data, through taking stock of assets, right? That you come to determine oh, wow, there are some gaps and challenges and needs in these other areas. And that's where you put your energy and resources, right, to kind of making a difference. And when you find that there are assets that are moving the needle in directions that are meaningful and important to the institution, then how do you make sure that perhaps maybe those are scaled? How do you double down on the things that are working, right? And so sometimes I caution people, don't go chasing the shiny, pretty things, right? Sometimes take stock of what you have that's working and double down on that, because sometimes those areas might even oftentimes are struggling for resources, and they could be doing so much more and having an exponential impact on, Latinx student success if they were only supported more.
Absolutely. So what I hear you saying in all of this is this work is institution specific, it's regional specific, it's state specific. HSI can't just be a one size fits all.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that there's lots for us to learn and contribute to as we share and exchange some of the work that's happening across our institutions. But I think also making sure that you're really coming to a good, well-informed understanding of what you think your institution needs, and how do you know that?
Right. Absolutely. And you're right. A lot of institutions are doing things that could be classified as servingness and serving students. And historically, I think about EOPs and TRIO programs and outreach programs that have been going on since well before either of us were doing any of this work. Yeah. Those fall under, right? I'm talking about coding. Those are coded as practices, structures for serving Latinx students, Black students, low income students, first gen students historically. So definitely, I agree. That's such an important part, is just sort of what are we already doing, and then how do we advance, right, within our own context. So the flip side is the challenges. This can't be. You make it look easy. You make this look like everybody could do this. What are the challenges to some of this work?
Yeah, well, Gina knows that it's not always so easy for me. It's not easy. And one of the things that I often share is that, I feel like oftentimes in my prior positions working at higher education institutions, the nature of the work that I did, always kind of allowed for a certain amount of degrees of separation between what I did and who I was as a person, right? In this role, there's no degrees of separation. I am this work and this work is me, and I say that with just the fullest heart and the fullest mind. And certainly, I because I was able to kind of design things, I suppose I designed it that way in many regards, right? And so I often say, you'll probably, not find a whole lot of, other people who are this, kind of passionate and overzealous about the work. But but it makes the wins, that much stronger, and it makes kind of the losses or the challenges that much stronger, right? So there's a lot of, it can be a lot of heartache and frustration, right? Around, not seeing something happen or getting a no when you really want to hear yes, or a not now, or things, frankly, sometimes maybe if they're not moving fast enough, right? So, the wins are extreme, feel extreme, and so do the losses and the heartaches feel extreme. So it's not, this work is not for the faint of heart. Most definitely. I think you really have to just love what you do. You have to be all in all the time. So it's not easy. There's a lot of spaces, I am, a small, but mighty, woman of color, and showing up to these tables are not easy. But I think that really focusing on meeting people where they're at, and engaging them in conversation, showing them the potential, showing them the impact, the vision for this work, identifying, common areas of interest and need, and then showing them that there's a path forward in building, partnerships of collaboration towards collectively approaching this work. And so, it just kind of takes a lot of, resilience and, kind of staying in the game. So.
Wow. When you said this work is me and I am this work, like I felt that. I was like, wow, that I feel like that too, right? I do this work, and my servingness journey too. It is me, right? I do this work because it's 100% me, right? So yeah, that's powerful to think that, like, we don't show up to do this HSI work because it's easy or because we're getting paid, this pushy salary to do it. No, like we actually do this work because this is what we care about and are passionate about.
Yeah. So, I mean, oftentimes, like I would describe it like it's not a position. It's like a calling. Like it's something that's far greater than a position at a higher education institution, right? Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that makes me still just so grounded in being connected to this work, right, is like I have, two kids myself, two teenagers, they're 16 and 13. And I can't help, I can't help but think about them. Like they're going to be, at some point in time, entering higher education institutions. What environments do I want them to step into, right? What experiences do I want them to have? I want them to step foot on campuses where they see faculty and staff, who look like them, who share aspects of their identity and their background and their experiences, right? I want them to feel affirmed and validated, and I want them to experience a sense of belonging and be prepared for, to be, community ready, to be workforce ready, to be grad school ready, and to lead thriving lives. And so I can't help but think about them and what I want for them and what I want for all students that come through this university and every other HSI. I also can't help but think about the younger version of myself, who was first generation Latina college student, like who didn't even know how to read a course catalog. And so, yes, I know I'm dating myself, but back in the day, they used to print those out like a phone book and you used to flip through them, right? Like I didn't even know what that was. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with that. And it was like, you want me to find a class? How do you, based off of what do you select, And so, I mean, I just can't help but think about myself and how I was yearning to find a sense of connection, a sense of community, to find, students who look like me, faculty who look like me. So I think about a lot of that. And I also can't help. I know that there are, elders and senior scholars who, and parents and families who have championed and advocated for this work, even particularly at this institution, like long before I ever arrived, right? And so I always feel like, I'm showing up at this point in time and this point of history for this work at this institution, but by no means am I, the first person to really advocate for, parity and equity and a sense of inclusion and a real kind of advocacy to be centering, servingness in all facets of what we do. And so, and I always feel too that, this community, I think, rolls large and it rolls deep. And so I always feel too that I have like 1,000 people, like 1,000 ancestors behind me, right? Like, rolling deep in this work with me. So that, you feel a sense of obligation and a responsibility and a calling to just keep moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about grants, which you talked about with the AZ HSI Consortium a little bit. One part of the servingness model, as you know, we talk about one structure of many structures is the grants, right? That grant getting is an important part of servingness, but everything you're talking about is also a model of how it's not just about the grants. That HSIs cannot be reduced to specifically this federal grants, right? So talk a little bit about that, about how you've used grants, both federal grants and local and other, foundation grants to enact servingness.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll definitely, I'll share one specific example, and it's one connected to our first Title V grant that we received. And that occurred in 2020. So we are officially in year 2 of that. And one of the things that we did is early on in the work of becoming an HSI, we spent a lot of time intentionally listening to our campus community, listening to our local and regional community. We actually kind of did a listening tour. We went around to whoever would have us, essentially, right? So we met with like superintendents and principals and K-12 educators and parents and families, local elected officials. We met with academic advisors and faculty and students. We met with whomever would listen to us. And we sat there and we, certainly engaged in facilitated conversation and talked to them a little bit about the designation and the University of Arizona, but we took a lot of notes and we were there primarily to be listeners. And I think that we engaged in a number of those types of activities for probably roughly about 1.5 to 2 years. And that is actually what ended up leading to informing our strategy for approaching the first Title V grant that we had. So one of the students at the time, she was a doctoral student in our Mexican American Studies program. She has now since graduated and is doing some amazing work. And she actually was an instructor at the local community college, which is Pima Community College, which is also an HSI. And she was an instructor who was employed by them and was teaching a dual enrollment course. And I am an administrator that likes to learn through experience. So I had a conversation with her about her teaching, and she ended up inviting me to attend the last class session of the dual enrollment course that she was teaching. And I said, absolutely, I would love to go with you. And she was actually teaching a dual enrollment course for a community called Ajo, which is in Ajo, Arizona. And it is a very tiny rural part of Arizona. And without dual enrollment courses, I mean, this high school couldn't even offer the types of courses that you would even need to be eligible to apply to a higher education institution like the University of Arizona or elsewhere. And so I journeyed with her, to this very rural, remote part of Arizona. And literally, the K-8 school is one building. And then literally right next door, the next small building is the high school. That's how small we're talking about. Me coming from Southern California, that's really small. Ajo is really small. But I got to see, so she was actually teaching an ethnic studies course that students were able to get dual enrollment course credit from Pima Community College. And I just saw I witnessed for myself the profound impact that it had on students, the level of curricular offerings that it allowed for that really small high school to offer its students. And I got to kind of better understand what some of the needs were and what some of the aspirations were of students from that community. And I was also able to observe who at the time was a doctoral student. I was able to kind of observe how she engaged with the students, her teaching methods, her, pedagogical approach. And it was pretty amazing to witness that. So I took aspects of that experience and so many other conversations that we had listened to over the course of a year and a half listening tour. And we used that to inform our approach to the awarded Title V grant, which is called Project Outreach Familia. And what it does is it prioritizes a few things. It prioritizes parent and family engagement among local high Hispanic enrolling high schools. It offers a pre-calculus dual enrollment course that is currently being designed from an asset-based and place-based approach. And it's also awarding local high Hispanic enrolling high schools mini grants so that they can identify and build out greater capacity locally for their college-going efforts. And that's all informed by what they communicated to us as needs and priorities for their own communities. And so I think that even the approach of grant development work can be done in a way that centers servingness. And that's just kind of one example of one way that we've done it. And we actually have launched what's called an HSI Grants Development Institute. We beta tested that last summer, and we're going to offer it again this fall. But it really kind of is a one-day experience that really trains and supports faculty and staff who have interest in pursuing HSI-related grants. It really kind of teaches and supports them in approaching that type of work in that manner. Because, I want to make sure that the ways in which our own faculty and staff are approaching the work are synonymous with what I just described.
Okay, so speaking of, community engagement, you just talked about, really understanding the local community needs. Talk about that as a part of servingness, because we do talk about that in the servingness framework as well as far as like HSIs becoming community partners and really working with their local communities. And you've, definitely done some work in that area. So talk to us about the role of community engagement and servingness.
Yeah, absolutely. So, myself and two other colleagues, took a deep dive into some of that work. So my colleague, Guadalupe Lozano and Vignesh Subian were fortunate enough to, co-author a chapter, that's actually in one of your books. And we developed and proposed, a framework for HSIs to think about, kind of the lenses and the values and the approaches that HSIs, likely should be cognizant of and take on in their relationship building and in their collaboration with community partners. So definitely would encourage folks to check that out. But, community engagement, that's one of the parts of my job that I really love. I do that, oftentimes I'll tease people, they ask about my social life. And essentially my social life oftentimes is my community engagement work. And it's both fun. And I also say that it's soul nourishing, which it absolutely is. It replenishes me. It keeps me full. And I think it provides that continuity between community-based priorities, needs, and then how we're committing to the work here at the University of Arizona. So I need them to keep guiding me and being my North Star to this work. But there's a couple of ways that approach kind of shows up in a very practical sense. One, I think this is like low lift, and I think it's relatively easy, but I think it requires great intentionality. So for example, supporting local business owners of color. That is one way where we do some of our community engagement work. So for example, the last session of the HSI Fellows this past spring, I held it, at a location where it's owned by, these two men of color who I engaged, with quite frequently. around some community-based work. And, we held our last session there. It's like, okay, if you're going to give your money, you could divert, kind of maybe expensive catering on your own campus and pour that in, to your local community and support some local business owners, particularly, local business owners who are owners of color. So that's kind of an easy lift. I think, another way is we actually, on our advisory board. So we have an advisory board for our Title V project, Project Outreach Familia. And one of our advisory board members, Adalita Grijalva, she's actually a supervisor of the Pima Community District 5 office, for example. And so that's like, an elected official who's like a native Tucsonan, heavily invested in the community, has sat on school boards, and has been very engaged in the community. It's like, let's leverage that expertise within the community and have them serve on an advisory board so that they continue guiding and kind of influencing the direction of our Title V project, for example. One of the other ways in which that has happened is, so myself and my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Judy Marquez Guillama, who is with us, she serves as the Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Development. And she and I are often, co-conspirators and colleagues in many endeavors. She and I both have faculty appointments within the Center for the Study of Higher Education here at the University of Arizona. And this past year, we launched a new graduate level course focused on funds of knowledge and HSIs. And we specifically designed it to be a year-long course because there was going to be a community-based partnership that we were going to have the students cultivate, nurture, and execute on by the end of the class. And we wanted to make sure it's like, you can't fit that type of relationship building into a semester, right? It's not like, okay, start, let's ramp it up, and then we're done. But it's like, no, we're going to model for these students what cultivating and centering servingness looks like relative to community partnerships, right? And we're going to model that work for them, and we're actually going to bring them along in the process. And so we ended up partnering with a couple of local for-profit local businesses that are owned by individuals of color in this community, as well as nonprofit organizations. And that's kind of another way is if you have the opportunity where you are teaching students, how do you think about some of that authentic collaboration with the community and making those connections with the courses that you teach? How are you modeling for the students what it means to show up and really cultivate authentic, genuine partnerships where it's grounded in things like mutual benefit and reciprocity, which is something that we talk about in the framework relative to community partnerships. So, I think that those are some quick examples of how that has showed up for us. But one of the interesting experiences that I also got to have this past spring is my community knows, like, I rarely, if ever, will say no to them. I always say when the community calls, I always say, what do you need me to do? Where do you need me? And when do you need me to show up? I'll be there. And so one of my dear colleagues and friends, Selena Barajas, she's owner of Mi Reina Mobile Boutiques. She had this grand idea to actually launch an inaugural Reina prom giveaway competition. And so while like a prom giveaway competition is likely something that you would never think about within the scope of work or purview of an assistant vice provost for HSI Initiatives, like I said, when the community calls, I say, where do you need me and what do you need me to do? And she asked me to be a judge in that competition that she held. And it was so phenomenal because I would have to say it was the most profound outreach event that actually wasn't an outreach event. And what it did for me is like it took a community member to model for me what was possible, because I think we are often so ingrained as longtime educators in thinking about what things are supposed to look like. And we need to have experiences that allow us to kind of free our minds and free our hearts to think differently about how experiences can be constructed that potentially are just so much more authentic and validating, and actually cultivate better college going pathways than how we originally think about designing them. So it's pretty profound. I take my community partnership work pretty seriously.
Absolutely. And I've witnessed that. That's why I wanted you to talk about that. I feel like I'm doing data analysis right now. Everything you talk about, I'm like mapping on to like the Servingness framework. I'm like, that's Servingness, that's this part. Now the part I want you to talk about as a final element that I know also is important is the external influences part. That's also in the Servingness framework, and how like state and local policies affect servingness. Either they can help or hinder. So what are your thoughts on how you navigated those external, like policy forces?
Yeah, so that is definitely been that was a big aspect of transition for me, I think, in coming from Southern California to the state of Arizona. Definitely a different political climate, even within the higher education realm, so I think a couple of things that have really impacted and posed some challenges and really have had to kind of force us to get quite creative in some of our endeavors, right? So, I think one is, there's been certainly some longstanding historical, pushback against ethnic studies in the state of Arizona. Tucson Unified School District, which is, the local school district, is quite historical in that endeavor. And there's been many faculty and community members that have been longstanding advocates, scholars, and families who have been pushing for that. But that steeped in rich, deep, complicated history is definitely one in the state of Arizona around ethnic studies. Tucson Unified School District actually, has a desegregation order. And so that's the extent that it got here in the state of Arizona. And so, thankfully, with the advocacy of many, there's an amazing, vibrant, and highly engaged Mexican American Studies program in Tucson Unified School District, thanks to that level of advocacy. So we have, things like that are riddled throughout the history of the state of Arizona. Currently, I'm actually tomorrow night going to be going to a fundraising event where I'm very proud to say, my president of the University of Arizona is going to be speaking at, and that is connected to Proposition 308, which is advocating for in-state tuition for DACA students, which we currently do not have. Currently, DACA students pay tuition here at the University of Arizona at a rate of 150%. So we have Prop 308, which is on the docket currently. We also have a governor who recently just signed the most expansive school choice legislation nearly in the state's history. And that only serves to continue to disenfranchise and further create inequitable disparities within our K-12 education systems, which only further get exacerbated and pose challenges at the idea of a college-going culture and population within the state of Arizona. So there's, quite some contextual pieces which make things a bit complex to navigate and make it a little bit harder to do some of this work.
Absolutely. That's exactly the things I think about when I think about those external influences. In Arizona, I mean, y'all, it's political, there's politics, there's the US-Mexico border, there's a large Native American population, right? There's so many layers to Arizona that we might need a whole nother episode just to talk about the external influences on servingness.
Yeah, and we actually just either last week or 2 weeks ago, just announced that starting in the fall of 2022, we will be essentially covering tuition and fees for Native American students. And so, we reside within a state that has 22 federally recognized tribes, and we have senior level leadership at this university that have an explicit focus on Native American initiatives and tribal leadership, right? And so what does sovereignty mean within the context of a land grant institution, a four-year public institution, an HSI within Southern Arizona, right? And so, certainly I think that announcement was key and a long time coming, right? And I think the continued conversations and commitments about what does that continue to look like beyond that, right? We want to make sure that while access is important, right, how do we ensure that the educational environment in which those students step into, right, is one that validates who they are, right, meets them where they're at in the process, sees them as assets, right? Are they going to come here and see, Native faculty and staff? Are they going to see, their culture and their history represented in a way that's authentic and genuine to their lived experiences?
Absolutely. And also a great example of how HSI and Servingness isn't exclusive to the Hispanic, right? That's Servingness. It addresses long-term inequities and long-term disparities, right? And you just gave a great example of what that looks like with Native American population, which has long historical inequities that we need to address and HSI should be addressing. So
absolutely.
Awesome. So final question, it's off the top, people show up to, they want to know what's happening with the HSIs. So how do you respond to that? And the brief response, ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
All I have to say is that it is exciting times for HSIs. I recall, when I first started out in this work in 2015, and there wasn't a whole lot of conversation even back then about HSIs. So I guess, I'm excited to see where all of this work is going. I mean, major kudos to you. I'm super excited about the work that you're, helping to launch, helping to kind of put it in the hands of all different types of stakeholders across the nation. So I'm just excited to be doing this work. I'm certainly excited to always have you an email away, a text away, and so I'm just excited to be doing this work in community with the community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, mi hermana, for being here with me today and for sharing all your wonderful knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. So happy to be here. Excited for what's ahead.